Anybody been watching The History Detectives on PBS? Yeah, did you see the one a few weeks ago on the cable they found on Cape Cod? You'd see my name in the credits. So as Tom says, when anybody's looking for cable information, they find me. So I did quite a bit of consulting on it for them, provided a number of images, and they gave me a nice credit. So but what I'm going to do tonight is it's probably a History Detective kind of thing, but without the high-paid presenter and without the 20 researchers in their garret in New York City. So this is all my own work. And I'm going to talk about Henry Clifford, who was a mechanical engineer. You know, normally we talk about the electrical side of cables, but so Henry Clifford was in the cable industry for 36 years, and he started in 1856 before the first Atlantic cable, but our paths didn't cross until 10 years later in 1866. And I was familiar with his name. He's in all the histories of the Atlantic cable. He designed the cable laying machinery and then improved it on each successive voyage, until finally they laid the cable in 1866 and went back and picked up the 1865 cable. But what I didn't realize was that he was also an artist, which is kind of a strange combination, a mechanical engineer and an artist. But in January 2008, I saw a listing at an English auction house, and it said simply, Lot 97, H. Clifford, a cable laying ship with paddle wheels, 6 masts and 4 funnels, signed. Now, there's no illustration with this, but the artist's name sounded familiar, and the cable ship with paddle wheels has to be the Great Eastern. So that was interesting. Let me ask the auctioneer for an image. So I requested an image, and they sent it over for me. And it's back to there. Yeah. Okay. And they sent me this. It's an 8x10 kind of watercolor, and obviously it's the Great Eastern. So I started looking a bit more at Henry Clifford. The auction wasn't for a couple of weeks. I had some time to do some more research. And I look at my own site first. Now, my site has so many pages that I've lost track of them, but I have a Google search engine that searches the site. So searching there, I found that Clifford was the assistant to Charles Bright, who was knighted for his services to the cable industry. And Charles Bright worked on the 1857 and 58 cables. And he was also assistant to Samuel Canning, who again was knighted on the 1865 and 66 cables. So Clifford was very, very much involved with this, and he worked on the machinery for the Agamemnon and the Niagara in 1857 and 58, and then for the Great Eastern. So the auctioneer sent me the photo, and Clifford had also sailed on all of these voyages, so he was out on board the ship supervising the machinery and the cable laying. So, so I left a bit on the painting and continued researching. And on the National Maritime Museum site in Greenwich, just up the river from where the cables are made, they have some paintings by Henry Clifford. And one of them is titled The Cable Ship. And this is an oil painting framed with an engraved plate on it. And that one looks like this. So if you compare these, now this is, I said, the preliminary work was about 8x10. This is the full-size oil painting, about 24x18 perhaps. But if you look at the two of these, you can see that the one is the preliminary or the study for the other. So this is the one that's at the National Maritime Museum, and this says, the Great Eastern laying the first successful Atlantic cable in 1866, painted by Henry Clifford, the second engineer. So what he did evidently is that he would paint while he was out at sea, do sketches, watercolors, and when he got back he'd do oils. And he loved the Great Eastern. But so checking the catalogue in the Maritime Museum, they have 3 more oil paintings by him and a number of watercolors and sketches. Now, of course, they're in London and I'm in New York, but I'm frequently in England, so I made a note to follow up on that subsequently. And looking at art reference books, I found Henry Clifford is a listed artist. He'd exhibited in London, and that his son was also a painter. And what happened, in fact, the paintings came down in the family, and in 1947, Clifford's son actually gave the paintings to the National Maritime Museum. So the next project was to find more information on Henry Clifford's work on the cable expedition. So I went to my printed library, my books, and there's a very good book by Willoughby Smith called The Rise and Extension of Submarine Telegraphy, written in the late 1800s, which is a history of the first 50 years of submarine telegraphy. And while they were out on the Great Eastern, they actually had a newspaper on board ship. They had a full print shop there. They made lithographic plates, they printed a daily newspaper, they did reports, of course they were in communication over the cable with England, so they had stock market reports, the news every day, and that was really the first on-board newspaper with live news out at sea. And Henry O'Neill did a sketch of various personalities, and one of the sketches is of Clifford, and it's identified, and I looked at it, and I said, Well, now I have a book with some photographs in it about the Atlantic cable. One of the photographs I could never identify who this one person was. The other people were William Thompson, who was easy, Cyrus Field, very easy, Samuel Canning. But looking at this, the photograph in the book was obviously Henry Clifford. So that was a mystery explained that I didn't know about. So the next thing was to check online census records, birth, marriage, and death records. And I found that he was born in the north of England. I'm from the north of England, I'm from Manchester, which is on the west side of England. And Clifford was from Hull, which is a seaport on the northeast. And he was born in 1821, and he came from a family of shipbuilders and engineers. So naturally, his father apprenticed him to an engineer, sent him out to Aberdeen in Scotland, and in 1841, he's finishing up his apprenticeship. So how did he come from the north of England as an engineering firm apprentice down to London to work on the cables? That's kind of a stretch, you know. So Charles Bright, who I mentioned that he had actually worked for, had a biography written after he died, again at the end of the 19th century. And I found a reference that Henry Clifford was a cousin of Charles Bright's wife, and her family had a connection to Hull. So perhaps Clifford had come to London through his family connections. So, of course, Charles Bright was the lead figure on the first Atlantic cables in 1857 and 58. So, for the moment, that was all I found. The painting had come to auction, and I won the painting at the auction. I was here, the painting was in England still, so I had the photograph of it at least. So, I thought, let me just check on eBay, because you never know what's going to show up on eBay. And that same week that I got the notice that I won the auction, somebody listed some watercolors like H. Clifford on eBay. So I looked at the photographs of those, and one of them is a nice watercolor, seascape, a view of the shore and cliffs. It's just titled Marabut, M-A-R-A-B-U-T, which looks like this. So it's taken from the water, and you've got these very distinctive rock formations, the striations in the cliffs and the rolling hills. So I do a search on Marabou, and I say it's a Moroccan term, so I start looking for photographs of Morocco. And there are various what they call geophotography sites online, where they take a geographic location and they tag photographs to it. So looking in the area, I found some work by a Spanish photographer, and he had identified the place, and he had a very similar photograph to these cliffs. And it turns out it's actually on the coast of Morocco in the Straits of Gibraltar. And this is dated, you can't quite see it, but it's actually dated 1861. So I checked some of the cable records, and Henry Clifford was on a cable expedition in the Mediterranean at that exact time. So I bought this painting at the eBay seller, and he had two others that I bought from him, similar scenes in the Mediterranean. So now we've got this mechanical engineer, and he's on board ship making paintings. Okay, so it gets even stranger. So now it's getting close to Easter when I always go to England. So getting ready for the trip, and I thought, let me do one more search and see if I can find anything else. And I find a local London newspaper had some of their backstories online, and there'd been an exhibition in 2002, this is now 6 years earlier, and the exhibition was at St. Nicholas Church in Chiswick, which is a suburb in the west of London. And interestingly, Charles Bright is buried there. So Charles Bright leading the cable expedition, his wife is Henry Clifford's cousin, and there's a mention of Henry Clifford in this report. And what had happened was, Charles Bright is buried at this church, but his grave had been lost for many years. It was kind of overgrown, and his great-grandson, who lived in South Africa, got in touch with the church and said, I know you have my great-grandfather buried, I'd like to see his grave. And he said, well, we don't know where it is. So he came over to London, and they started searching for it. And they found that he didn't have a vertical headstone, he just had a plain cross. We had a very elaborate gravestone, so the full length of the gravestone was carved, but he'd been buried over and grassed over. So they find this, and they think, well, here's an interesting guy. They have an active archives group at the church, which is a very old church. So they do an exhibition on Charles Bright and the cable industry. And as it happens, one of the people working at the archive there had a friend whose name was Elizabeth Clifford, who turns out was Henry Clifford's granddaughter. And she tells them the story, the family story, and she had a piece of the original cable and a slice of cable made into a pendant, a model of the Great Eastern, some paintings. So some of this was featured in this exhibition. So it did report that Elizabeth Clifford had by this time died, and I couldn't find a contact address. Well, there was an address for one of the ladies at the archive, so I actually wrote a letter and posted it. This is heresy for an online researcher, but you know, you do what you have to do. So And I said, I'm coming over to England, you know, could you give me any more information? And sadly, again, this lady herself had died, but her husband was very kind enough to forward the letter on to somebody else, and who he sent it to was Henry Clifford's great-granddaughter. Okay? So now I'm in email contact with Clifford's great-granddaughter, a lady named J.C. Wall, and she had some interesting information, because she said she didn't have all that much that had come down in the family, because her uncle, Henry Dalton Clifford, who they called Tony, because the family was full of Henry, so they called from Dalton, they called him Tony. So Tony Clifford, Henry Clifford's grandson, had written an unpublished history of the family based on original letters and documents and artifacts that had come down all the way from the 1850s. And this material had gone to some of it to the National Maritime Museum in London, and some of it to the Maritime Museum in Hull, where the family was from. So I think, right, well, I'm going to be in England, let me email the Hull Museum. So I emailed them, got a nice reply from the curator, said, why don't you come and see us? My family, as I said, from the other side of England, but it's a 100-mile drive, so my wife and I set out in the car and did a day trip over to Hull, to the Maritime Museum. And the curator took us up into the attic and pulled open his filing cabinets, and he brought the Henry Clifford material out for us to look at. And this immediately looked very, very useful. Tony Clifford's family history type was over 200 pages. There was a family album with portraits of Henry Clifford and his family, 2 of Henry Clifford's engineering notebooks when he was working on the Atlantic cable, his daily work reports, and another one from, let's see, from a little later when he was working on other cable expeditions. And the family history had transcripts of letters to his parents, how he got into engineering, and so on. So the curator was nice enough to make me a full copy, photocopy of the history. And I said, well, you know, could I photograph some of the other documents? I said, I'll leave you to it, let me know when you're done. So my wife flipped through the pages one by one, I photographed them, and got a copy of everything. So, and I thought, well, you know, doesn't hurt to check eBay again for Henry Clifford. We're on a roll here. And up comes another item from Henry Clifford, which is a sealing wax seal. You know, you would pour molten wax, you melt wax with a candle, put it on the flap of your envelope, and stamp it with your seal, so that it was official, or on a legal document, or a contract, or official papers. So what we find here, this is a mirror image so you can read it. It says H. Clifford, Engineer, Hull. Okay. So, so what was he doing now? Now we know he'd been an engineering apprentice, he'd been up in Aberdeen. Apparently at some point he's back in Hull. And let's say Clifford's family had been associated with shipbuilding. And apparently from the family history, Henry had always wanted to be an artist. He was quite talented, but his father said, none of that, lad, off you go to engineering school, you know. So, but when he came back to Hull, he started in a business with 2 partners. One of them, unfortunately, had financial difficulties, and through no fault of Henry's, the partnership was dissolved.